The most expensive document on the McLean Breaks Ranch was not the purchase agreement. It was not the soil report. It was not the glossy stocking plan printed in Denver and shipped in a black binder with plastic tabs. It was a pencil map on yellow legal paper, taped crookedly inside a ranch office window, with one dark line drawn across the northern hills, and 6 words written beneath it. Do not winter cattle above this cut. The man who drew that map was named Wade Halvorsen, and for most of his life, people thought Wade owned an ordinary piece of dry country in northeastern Wyoming. From the highway, it did look ordinary. Sage flats, wire fences, a few windmills turning in the distance, gray buttes sitting low under a hard sky. The kind of country a person could cross in 20 minutes and remember as empty. But Wade would have told you empty was the wrong word. Empty only meant you did not know what you were looking at. Wade was 52 years old in the autumn of 1989, third-generation cattleman. His grandfather had come into the Powder River country after the First World War with 2 mares, a borrowed wagon, and a debt he carried for 11 years. Wade's father had held the place through blizzards, grasshopper years, and the price collapse that taught a whole generation of ranchers that cattle could break a man slowly. Wade had held on for a different reason. He knew his ground, not the way a consultant knows a ground sample, not the way a banker knows a legal description. Wade knew it the way a tired old cow knows where the last shelter is when the wind comes in blue and mean from the north. Every morning, before breakfast if the weather was changing, after breakfast if it was not, Wade walked or rode a piece of his 5,800 acres and wrote down what the country was doing. He had been doing it since 1968. By 1989, he had filled 21 brown field books: rainfall, tank depth, calving losses, wind direction, where snow scoured clean, where it drifted deep, which grass came back first after a wet May, which pond looked full in June and betrayed you in August. His handwriting never changed much. Blocky, spare, patient. The writing of a man who had learned that land punishes people who hurry to describe it. There were 3 things Wade knew about the ranch across his north fence, the old McLean Breaks place. 3 things that mattered. 3 things that did not show up clearly in aerial photographs, county maps, or a graduate-level range model. The first was the water. On paper, the eastern benches held 7 stock ponds and 2 spring boxes. That sounded reliable. But Wade knew 3 of those ponds sat over cracked bentonite and shallow blue clay. In the second hard summer after a wet cycle, they did not go down evenly. They held a shiny skin of water until one hot week in July, and then they dropped like somebody had pulled a plug. He had seen it in 1970, again in 1977, again in 1984. Same ponds, same timing, same false promise. The second was a narrow cut through the North Breaks that old-timers called Knife Gate Coulee. From a pickup window it looked like shelter, low sides, a little grass. a natural place for cattle to drift out of weather. But in a hard north blow, Knife Gate did not shelter anything. It gathered wind. It pulled it down the hills and squeezed it through the cut until the air inside ran 12, sometimes 18 degrees colder than the flats around it. Cattle drift with wind at their backs. Wade had learned that lesson in 1972 when he lost 17 bred cows before dawn and found them bunched against a fence in blue daylight. He never wintered cattle above Knife Gate again. The third was a pale green plant that came up early on the west alkali apron before the good grass had woken. Death camas. In most years, it was just another warning in the ground. But after a wet winter followed by a cold March, it came thick and clean and tempting. Young cattle turned in there too early would eat it because it was green before anything else was green. Then the trouble came in their legs, their breathing, their eyes. Wade knew the patch by memory. He knew the moisture pattern that made it dangerous. He knew that the next bad spring was coming. That was the country next door. That was what Wade knew. Then, in October of 1989, the McLean family lost the whole ranch at a foreclosure sale held in a county meeting room under fluorescent lights that made everyone look poorer than they already felt. The ranching crisis in the northern plains had not arrived all at once. It came in interest rates, drought years, weak calf prices, machinery notes, and bank letters with polite language that could still take a man's land. By the late 1980s, outside capital had started circling distressed ranches the way coyotes circle a calving pasture. They saw acreage. They saw discount pricing. They saw an asset class. What they did not always see was the country itself. The buyer was Prairie Meridian Asset Group, a Denver-based agricultural holding company backed by investors in Chicago and Minneapolis. Their plan was simple: buy hard-hit ranches, restock them, apply modern management, and sell within 6 years to recreational buyers or larger cattle outfits at a profit. They had money. They had software. They had binders. They had a field director named Martin Voss, 43 years old, finance background, ranch portfolio experience, fluent in projections, and confident in the way men become confident when numbers have usually obeyed them. His operations lead was Aaron Bell, 31, degree in range science, sharp, hard-working, and good at the world she had been trained to measure. There were 2 junior analysts, 1 bookkeeper, 3 hired hands, and a young field assistant named Nora Keene. Nora was 25. Animal science degree from the University of Wyoming, raised on a small place near Torrington that was never big enough to make anybody rich, but was big enough to teach humility. She had been with Prairie Meridian for 5 months, and she already understood something her superiors had not learned yet. A new ranch does not introduce itself just because you bought it. Prairie Meridian took possession of 16,900 acres in November. By February, they were running almost 1,300 head, with plans to push toward 2,000 if the spring grass came early. Wade watched the trucks come in from across the fence. He watched where they unloaded the replacement heifers. He watched which gates they left open. And when he saw the north pasture fill with the best young cattle on the place, the ones closest to Knife Gate Coulee. He stopped mending fence and stood still for a long time. The next Tuesday, Wade drove 9 miles around to the old McLean machine shed, which Prairie Meridian had turned into a side office. He wore clean jeans, a canvas coat, and the good hat he saved for town. He was not poor. He was not backward. He was a working cattleman dressed the way a working cattleman dresses when he means to be respectful. Martin Voss was there from Denver. Aaron Bell was there with a clipboard. Nora Keene sat at a folding table near the heater, taking notes on a yellow pad. Wade took off his hat inside the office and held it in both hands. Then he told them what the ranch was going to do. He told them about the eastern ponds and the clay seams under them. He told them the second dry summer was the dangerous one, not the first. He told them about Knife Gate Coulee and how the north wind behaved there. He told them about the death camas on the alkali apron and why the coming spring had the right look for a bad flush. He spoke for 12 minutes, not like a prophet, like a man giving directions to a hospital. Martin listened politely. He thanked Wade for coming in. He said Prairie Meridian had completed hydrology checks, forage surveys, and winter exposure mapping before stocking the property. Aaron said she appreciated neighbor knowledge, but the management plan had already accounted for environmental variables. That was the phrase she used. Environmental variables. Wade looked down at his hat brim. Then he said, "That Coulee is not a variable." Trap. Aaron told him the regional weather data did not show a significant cold sink in that pasture. "No," Wade said, "it would not." No one spoke for a moment. Then Wade put his hat back on, thanked them for their time, and walked out. After he left, Martin said something about neighbor anxiety. Aaron returned to her chart. The heater clicked and rattled. Nora Keene did not say a word. She wrote 4 lines on her yellow pad. East ponds fail after second hard summer. Knife Gate Coulee pulls north wind colder. Death camas west apron after wet winter, cold March. Wade says bad spring coming. Then she closed the pad. And that small act mattered more than anyone in the room understood. The first thing that went wrong was the wind. On the night of December 21st, 1989, a blue norther came down across Montana and into the Powder River country with the kind of cold that makes metal sound brittle. The official low in town was 7 below zero. Bad, but not historic. Local ranchers moved cattle into protected bottoms and waited. Prairie Meridian's 310 replacement heifers were in the north pasture, above Knife Gate Coulee, in ground that looked acceptable on the winter exposure map. But cattle do not read maps. They read pressure, wind, fear, and fences. By midnight, the storm was pushing hard out of the north. The herd drifted. By 2 in the morning, most of those heifers had entered Knife Gate. The Coulee narrowed around them. The wind accelerated. Snow dust lifted off the ground in sheets. The temperature inside the cut dropped far below the official reading. By daylight, 184 heifers were dead or dying against the lower fence. Some were still standing. Erin Bell reached the pasture just after sunrise. She got out of the truck, took 2 steps, and stopped. Her clipboard hung at her side. For once, there was nothing useful on it. The second thing that went wrong was the water. The summer of 1990 was not a record drought. That was the problem. On paper, it looked manageable. Below average rainfall, hot July, nothing the model considered catastrophic. But Wade had not warned them about a catastrophic year. He had warned them about a particular year on particular ground. By the 3rd week of July, the 3 eastern ponds over blue clay dropped in the same sequence Wade had watched for 2 decades. One held mud under a bright skin. One went sour. One went dry at the edges and then disappeared in 4 days. Prairie Meridian's hands noticed too late. They started hauling water, but the cattle had already walked miles in heat and lost condition. Cows slipped calves. Yearlings fell behind target weights. The fall numbers, the numbers Martin had been so comfortable with, began turning against him 1 pound at a time. The third thing that went wrong was the camas. 90, after a wet winter and a cold March, the West Alkali apron came up pale green before the needlegrass and blue grama had much to offer. Prairie Meridian turned a group of thin yearlings in there because the pasture looked early. It was early. That was the danger. By the end of the month, more than 150 head were showing signs of poisoning. 34 died. The rest were pulled, treated, and eventually sold light because they never quite came back right. When the losses were added together, the frozen heifers, the water failure, the poisoned yearlings, the weak calves, the emergency trucking, the veterinary bills, and the missed sale weights, Prairie Meridian had lost roughly 40% of the ranch's projected cattle value in 1 operating year. That is not volatility. That is a lesson with teeth. Now, here is where the story could have ended the way these stories usually end. The company could have blamed the weather. They could have blamed hired hands. They could have sold the place at a discount, fired the field team, and told investors the asset had suffered unusual environmental pressure. Instead, a woman named Ruth Carden flew in from Denver. Ruth was 61, senior vice president, 29 years in agricultural finance, and before any of that, a ranch girl from the Nebraska Sandhills. She had spent enough winter mornings breaking ice to understand the difference between bad luck and bad management. She read the reports. Then she read them again. The reports were careful. They were technical. They were also incomplete in the way a clean autopsy can be incomplete if nobody asks why the patient was standing in the road. Ruth asked Martin who the neighbors were. He mentioned Wade Halvorsen as an older rancher who had come by the office once with concerns. Ruth asked what concerns. Martin did not remember the details. Nora Keene did. She opened her yellow pad to the page from the previous spring and set it in front of Ruth. 4 lines, 4 plain warnings. Wind, water, poison, timing. Written months before the ranch lost hundreds of head to those exact things. Ruth looked at the page for a long time. Then she said, "Take me to him." Wade received them at his kitchen table without ceremony. His wife had left coffee on the stove and a pan of sourdough biscuits under a towel. His field books sat on a shelf beside the window, 21 brown spines in a row, sun-faded on one side because the morning light hit them there. Ruth did not start with an apology. She started with the only sentence that mattered. "Mr. Halvorsen, I would like to understand what you know about that ranch." Wade watched her for a moment. There are men who will talk all day because they like the sound of themselves. Wade was not one of them. He had spent years learning from a country that never repeated itself loudly. So when he answered, he did it slowly. He pulled down the books. He showed her 1970, then 1977, then 1984. The same eastern ponds failing after the same kind of summer. He showed her a winter entry from 1972, the year Knifegate cost him 17 cows. He showed her notes from 3 bad Camas springs, each one tied to winter moisture and March cold. Nora wrote as fast as she could. Ruth listened, not with the politeness of a person waiting to speak, with the attention of a person who knows money has already been lost and is trying to find the door it escaped through. After almost 2 hours, Ruth closed one of the field books and placed both hands on the table. "What would it take," she asked, "for Prairie Meridian to have formal access to this knowledge?" Wade looked out the kitchen window toward the north fence. He was quiet long enough that Nora stopped writing. Then he named a fee. Fair, not small, not greedy. Ruth did not negotiate. Wade added one condition. "You do not hire me to decorate your reports," he said. "If I tell you the ground is wrong, you move the cattle." Ruth nodded. "That is why I am here," she said. The next operating year, Prairie Meridian did 3 things differently. South of Knifegate, and left the north pasture empty when the first blue fronts began forming. They reduced cattle on the eastern benches and staged emergency water before the ponds failed, not after. They fenced the west alkali apron and did not graze it until the native grasses were high enough that the cattle would not be forced into the Camas. They also hired Nora full-time with a new job description that was never written in corporate language, because corporate language would have ruined it. Spend time with Wade. Write down what he sees. Ask before the land has to shout. In 1991, the McLean Breaks herd losses came in under 2%. Boring numbers. The kind of numbers a ranch survives on. Wade still kept his own place, still checked his tanks before breakfast, still wrote in the same blocky hand, still complained that the coffee in the company office was weak enough to see through. But 3 mornings a week, he drove to the side office and looked at the charts taped to the wall. He did not reject the charts. That is important. Wade was not against measurement. He measured everything. He had measured rain, grass, water, wind, and animal behavior for 23 years before Prairie Meridian arrived with binders and called itself modern. The difference was not data versus instinct. The difference was shallow data versus lived data. One knew the ranch as a purchase, the other knew it as a place. By the fall of 1992, there was a new object in the front window of the old McLean machine shed. A pencil map on yellow legal paper. It showed the full 16,900 acres drawn in Wade's hand. The eastern ponds were circled. The west alkali apron was shaded. Knife Gate Coulee was marked with a dark line that looked almost too simple to have cost so much. Under it were 6 words: "Do not winter cattle above this cut." Visitors noticed the map because it looked homemade beside the printed projections and pasture schedules. But nobody in that office treated it as decoration. It was the most expensive education Prairie Meridian ever bought, and the cheapest insurance they ever kept. Wade's field books grew from 21 to 24. Nora copied the important patterns into ranch records, but the originals stayed in Wade's kitchen, on the shelf where the morning sun faded the spines. The country had not changed. The ponds had always failed that way. Knife Gate had always pulled the wind down colder than the flats. The camas had always risen early in the wrong spring. The only thing that changed was who was willing to listen before the losses became proof. That is the old lesson of ranch country. Tell you who owns the land, but it cannot tell you what the land remembers.